Today I'm going to be making a non-spoilery guide to the Wayfarers series by Becky Chambers. Here's the drill with my guide and the format that I'm going to be using. So in this one, we're going to be talking about the 4 books and the 1 novella. We're going to be talking about the world and the setup and like the political setup of the universe, kind of get you acquainted with what's going on, what the genre is, all of that. We're going to talk through, because this is a sci-fi spoiler, we're going to talk through some of the alien species that you see within the series. And then we're going to talk through the structure of each book and how each book kind of differs from each other in plot and in themes. And then we're going to talk reading orders. All of the timestamps for that is going to be below. This is going to be chaptered. If I missed saying anything now, it will be added in there. But without further ado, let's get into this. So this is a 4-book series. We have The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, A Closed and Common Orbit, A Record of a Spaceborne Few, The Galaxy and the Ground Within, and then a novella which is called A Good Heretic. So if you want to learn a little bit more about any of these specifically, I have reviews for each of the 4 main novels. I do not have a review for the novella because it's a 20-minute read, but I'll talk through that a little bit here. I will link all of those below. So let's talk about the setup of this book. This is a sci-fi series that takes place in space in the distant future, when humans are no longer living on Earth and are now living in space among other species. This is a sci-fi series, as I said. People like to talk about light sci-fi and hard sci-fi. This isn't like a hard sci-fi where we're going like deep into the mechanics of everything and how we got here and how things work. I kind of like to think of this series as like a good mix of the two. There's enough explanation of why things are the way they are so that it makes sense, and it satisfies those scientific-minded people without, at least from my understanding, breaking any laws of physics. But then for those people who don't want that science, don't want the sciencey aspects to go above their head, this will also work for you as well. It's a nice bridge between those two concepts, which I think makes it a great introductory series into science fiction as well, especially because if you read the first book and you don't like it, you don't have to keep reading because they're all companion novels, so you get a full plot with each book. Let's talk setting a little bit more. So as I said, this is taking place in the future. Basically, how the humans got into this situation is that humankind destroyed their planet. Some people stayed. Some people left and went to Mars, and some people left on ships, which is what most people did in what was called the Exodus Fleet. The Exodus Fleet chilled for quite a long time, and then alien species found them. So once alien species found them, then they eventually became part of the Galactic Commons, which is like the United Nations of aliens. There are tons of different alien species in the book, which kind of for me makes this like a more of a bridge between sci-fi and fantasy, because, you know, the idea of space travel and wormholes and all of that, those like science aspects are possible and potential. However, you know, alien species might be out there in real life, but they probably don't exist in the way that Becky Chambers came up with them. She had to do all the creation of the species, what they looked like, how they acted, their languages, all of that type of stuff, which puts it more on like the fantasy side of science fiction to me. Humans, however, are not powerful in this place. They are one of the least powerful species in the GC. The big players will start going through some of the aliens and give you some background on each of the type. So probably the most powerful species in the GC are the Harmagians. They're mollusk-type ocean dwellers that have left the oceans. They don't have backbones. They don't have spines. Their skin is very sensitive. They can't touch things. They're not very mobile out of the water. They have to ride around in carts. However, their minds are very powerful, and because of that, their technology is very powerful, and they have a long history of enslaving other species to do their mining and other labor. And it wasn't until wars with another species called the Aliens that they are no longer doing that. That war is what stopped them from enslaving different groups of species and also what created the GC back in the day. Oh, and we meet a Harmagian on the page in book 3. So let's go on to Aliwans. So Aliwans are also a very powerful species in the GC. They are known for their weaponry and are still participating in multiple active wars. Aliwans are humanoids that are covered in silvery scales. They talk through their facial features, so their cheeks can turn a bunch of different colors, and that's how they interact, so they don't have voice boxes. So they have to have implants in order to interact with other species in the GC. There's multiple genders of them. There are some that are female, there are some that are male, and then there are some that change between female and male with no notice. And it is a very large event and a big deal if you start shimmering as a female, and that means that you can lay an egg and procreate. We meet an Aliwan in book 1 as a side character, Pei, and then we see Pei again in book 4 in more detail and learn a lot more about her background. We also meet an Aliwan who is one of the gender-changing ones in book 2. Andrisks are another very large and powerful entity in the GC. During that war, the treaty that ended the wars between Harmagians and Aliwans, that was negotiated by Andrisks. Andrisks are reptilian-looking. They walk on 2 legs and have feathers and blue or green scales. They need warm conditions. They have lots of children, and they don't take care of their own children. They have different structures of families that they live in through time, one of which being a feather family, and they have a lot of casual sex. The main book that we meet and interact with an Andriskin is in book 1, and that is where we do most of our learning of the species as a whole. All right, now we have the Grum. The Grum are a very small species at this point. They're on the verge of extinction. They have been in wars that caused them to go extinct among themselves, which involve weapons that were procured from different entities in the GC. They have multiple vocal cords, and their language is very robust and musical. They have 6 different limbs, all of which can act as arms or legs, and they change biological sex over time. So they start female, and then in life that they have children when they're female, and then they become male later in life. And then later in life, after that, they end up somewhere between those 2 things. We meet one Grum in book 1, and that is Dr. Chef, and that is the only Grum we meet in the series. And I don't believe Grum are part of the GC. So they can exist within the GC, but they don't, as a species, have the rights of being a part of the GC. Next, let's talk about Quailin. So these are insect-like creatures. They have many legs. They can be described kind of as lobster centaurs. They are known to decorate themselves and their shells with gem and stones, and most other species find them hard to read and hard to understand what their emotions are. As far as breeding goes, the men carry the eggs through that life cycle period until they are born, or until they hatch, and they are a very bureaucratic species. They're a pretty xenophobic species. They have their kind of own part of the airspace in the GC, and they have access to quite a bit of resources, and they have very strict laws about how to behave in their space, and how to practice culture. We meet some Quailin while going through Quailin's airspace in book 1, and then we meet a Quailin more intimately and learn more about them as a species in book 4. The Cyanide, I don't quite remember what they look like, but they do have very fluffy fur that most of them shave down into specific patterns because they infect themselves at a young age with what they call the Whisperer. then they share a symbiotic relationship with this thing that others might perceive as a parasite. This thing changes the way that they view space and time, which makes them very great at conceptualizing multidimensional space and time. A lot of them end up becoming navigators for ships that punch into this space between space to kind of create wormholes. And when they're a cyanate pair, they go by we, and people refer to them as they. And they don't live to be very old. They like a lot of personal space. They're not very talkative. And there are some that break their pair and become singular once more. They are referred to by most cyanate pairs as heretics. We meet a cyanate pair in book 1, and we learn a little bit more about science in A Good Heretic, the novella. They are also a GC race. Next, we're going to talk about LaRue. LaRue are like red, fluffy llamas. They are a mammalian. They are in the GC, but they're not a powerful force in the GC, though they kind of live and exist all over the place. They can walk on 2 legs or 4. When they're young, they go by the pronoun zir, and when they reach adulthood, they choose a gender for themselves. They live very long lives, and because of that, they don't age up until their 20s, and that's typically when they reach adulthood. They don't have much in terms of technology for themselves because they were a discovered species. They also have different ideas of family where they see all LaRue as all of their family, and they don't think in terms of child, cousin, parent in the same way that others do. We see a LaRue in another book, but the main place that we explore them is book 4, and there are 2. There is an older female, and there is a younger one who is still ungendered and goes by zir pronouns. The last one that I'm going to talk about are acaracs. These are a species within the GC, but they don't have any parliamentary control. They look somewhat like birds and somewhat like monkeys. They walk around a lot using their arms. They have beaks, and some of them don't have control over their legs. It is a genetic issue that some of them have. They live very short lives, and they become specialists in whatever field that they want to be in. And they were a species that were enslaved for many years by Harmogians. And because of that, a lot of them live very difficult lives and result to stealing. And most other GC species don't really know much about them and have never interacted with them, but they do exist in GC space quite a bit. We meet some acaracs in book 1 very briefly, and then we meet one in a lot more detail and learn a lot more about their customs and culture in book 4 and their history in book 4. Okay, so that's all I'm going to go over for species. All right, let's start with The Long Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. Okay, so The Long Angry Planet follows a ship that punches holes into space and creates new wormholes that new ships can use in the future. So in this book, we're following a crew of many species and and humans as well. An AI, an artificial intelligence. We follow them kind of through. They have like an end goal of trying to get into a certain space because they need to punch a hole back so that the GC has access to this area. There's a lot of political issues going on people determining if they think they should be in that space or not. It's very serial in nature, so you have this main goal of where you're trying to end up, but each chapter is kind of a learning lesson for the characters about each other, about themselves, and they're slowly making their way there, seeing new places, doing new things, kind of building forward to this end goal. And there is a climax of the book, there is a resolution of what occurs, but it's much more character-focused in nature. A Close and Common Orbit follows mainly 2 characters. Both of them we met in the first book. We follow one person's past, and then we see them in the future along with that other character that I referenced. And I'm not saying the names of those characters because they would be spoilers to some of the things that happened at the end of the first. So this has two timelines, the one timeline of the past and the situation that they're in and them trying to leave their situation, and then you follow the present, and it is them and two other people for the most part, and you follow their journey trying to get comfortable with themselves as a person, comfortable with their bodies, and comfortable with the world around them. The pace of this one, I would say, is quite a bit faster. You're bouncing between two timelines, and because of that, as you drive forward, the chapters get shorter and shorter. They're longer at the beginning. You get to know the character. You get to kind of sit into the place and time. They get shorter and shorter, back and forthing as the kind of climax of both of the scenes and both of the time periods occur. Both of these are really about finding yourself. This one is with a group of people, so you're doing a lot of learning about other cultures and other people. And this one is a lot more self-focused and learning about yourself and what it means to be sentient, what it means to be a person, what it means to be yourself. Book 3, Record of a Spaceborne Few. This one follows humans, basically only humans. So it takes place on the Exodus fleet, which is a place where really only humans live. Many people have left at this point because humanity has wanted to move out and branch out and be a part of different parts of the society, and live in more mixed species cities and planets and worlds. These are the people that are left behind. It's a lot about the past and where humans came from and how they got to where they are at now and the future of where they might be headed. We follow many characters in this book. We follow 5 humans, and there is a Harmagian visiting the Exodus fleet, getting to learn more about them, and you see some of her research articles, blog entries. I don't really know how they're being given out to people, but we see them and we see humans from her perspective as a Harmagian being a lot different than humans and kind of looking at their culture and how they live here. In the Exodus fleet, because it's kind of a self-contained unit, a lot of the technology is very old. They don't like to take help from other species. Nothing is ever wasted. And we follow 5 different characters, many of them who live and contribute to the society in some capacity. One of them's a teenager who just wants to get out and explore his own way. One of them is a man in his 20s who comes back. He's not originally from the Exodus fleet, but everyone in the GC who's human is kind of from the Exodus fleet at some point. It's your roots, essentially, unless you were from Mars originally. They come to see this place and to get to kind of go back to their roots. You follow each of their perspectives, just kind of existing. There is at some point in time kind of a large event that occurs that kind of connects all the people, but not all of the people in this book know each other intimately. They're not all directly connected. I think that it made this book a little bit more challenging to get into than the others, but if you're looking to kind of understand the history of how humans made it into the GC, this would be the book to read. But this one, is much more slice of life, and the Exodus fleet really feels like this rural setting where there's a lot of people there, but there's not a whole lot to do, and it exists. The culture of this place is so much different than the culture of other places. They don't use cash or any exchange system. You don't need to have a job to make money then. You have to have a job to contribute to society. So it's much more of how do you want to contribute, not what you are making for yourself. Kind of just teaches you the lessons humans learned from their destructive ways on Earth, because that's why they had to leave this place. All right, the last book in the series, The Galaxy and the Ground Within. This is the only one that does not follow any humans. You follow LaRue, Akarak, Quaylen, and an alien one, you re-meet a character from the first book in this, Pei. They all end up at the space version of a rest stop. It's a planet that had no life on it, and they built it as kind of a midway station for people to stop, to gas up, to get food in between other places. And it has that really like rest stop vibe, in like you're on a highway and this is the last rest stop for 200 miles type thing. Of course, they were all only supposed to be there for a short period of time, but something happens and all of these different species end up at this place together for a while and have to learn how to get along. You get to delve pretty deep into a lot of their cultures, their way of life, how they feel about parenting, how they have their children, that type of thing, and also how they all fit into the GC, but then on an individual scale of like how their culture and their species and way of life has made them the way they are, and where they're trying to get to after this destination. This was one of my personal favorites of the series. I felt much more connected to all of the characters. You have a character who is exiled from their people and the fallout of that. You have a character who feels exiled from other people because they have no planet. Other species don't take the time to understand them, and they're always faced with microaggressions and hostility from other groups of individuals who don't take the time to know them as a person. And you kind of just see them all interacting. It builds up to a moment where something happens, and they kind of all have a resolution come out of that. The structure of it is that you have all of the people that you're following, and they all have different perspectives, but because it's like a closed circle of people, you follow each of them individually, but they're all interacting with each other. So while these two have similar setups, this has a lot more characters, and your characters that you're following aren't really interacting together necessarily, and there's more plot lines going on. And in this one, you're following the group of characters, but they are all interacting. So you have a chapter with one character that's the main focus, and then the other character, and then another character, and then they're all in the same area. So then you have a character, like a chapter called All, where they're all together and you all see them interacting. And then you have A Good Heretic, which is a very quick, less than 30-minute read of a novella, and it's really just about Cyanids and their culture, and you just very briefly follow the life of one of the Cyanids that you meet in book one. So we talked plot. That was quite a bit. Let's talk reading orders, okay? So these are all companion novels, so you really don't have to read them in order. However, just to get an intro into the universe, and because you will be spoiled by the ending of this if you read the others, I highly recommend just starting out reading The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, unless you really, really, really don't think this one's going to work for you, and you have to read a different one first. If you feel that way, if it's the second book you want to read first, you're going to have the character arc of one of your characters from the first book spoiled for you. So if you ever wanted to go back, you're going to know that person's character arc. For 3 and 4, for these two, you are going to have the plot line of the first book spoiled for you. So if you ever wanted to go back and read the first book, you're going to know what ends up happening in the end. The books are more character focused than they are plot focused. So I don't want to say it's obvious what happened, but I don't think it's a big deal really to know it. I'd still recommend reading the first one first, because then, let's say you've read the first one, then you could read the second one next, the third one next, or the fourth one next. It doesn't matter. Or the novella. None of these three spoil each other. So you can read 2, 3, and 4 all out of order, and it doesn't matter, because none of them have anything to do with each other. The second and third book kind of take place at the same time. They both start kind of within the last chapter of the first book. And then this one is at some time in the future after that. It's not like way in the future, because you do have some character overlap, but it's probably within like a few standards, which is like probably less than a standard, which is like their version of a year. I don't actually know how long it is. If you don't want the first book spoiled for you and you haven't read it yet, don't read the synopsis of this. This will spoil the first book. These two, you can read the synopsis. It won't spoil the first book at all. So just something to keep in mind. Let's talk about my suggested reading orders, depending on what kind of reader you are. So I would say just read this one. It's a nice intro into the universe. It'll let you know if you like the style or not. You're just following one group of people and you're following one perspective the whole time. Like, it's debatable how many main characters you have, but it's not confusing. You're not trying to jump back and forth. You're not trying to learn a bunch of characters at once. You're following a character as she gets onto the crew, and she's learning all the crew, so you're learning with her. So it's very easy to get into. It'll let you know if you like Becky Chambers' writing style. It'll let you know if you like the plot style of this. Because if you don't like the serial nature of it and you kind of want more plot to it, you're not going to like the other books. A Close and Common Orbit should be your next read if you really want to be reading about identity, really focused on identity, what it means to be human or what it means to be sentient. This one is a lot more focused on individual people. I would say that there's a lot more anxiety in the characters that you're following. This one, really, if you want to learn about the Exodus fleet, and if you don't mind like the larger learning curve for understanding the characters and how they relate to each other. And then if you want to learn more about different species, this is the one I recommend getting into next. And not focusing on humans. A Good Heretic, I think you could kind of fit anywhere, but it would just make more sense to read it right after reading the first book, because that's the only book in the series where you're really focusing on a Cyanate pair and understanding anything about Cyanate culture. The Cyanate that you follow in A Good Heretic is one of the ones that you meet in the first book. Let's also talk about the audiobooks really quick. So I consumed all of these on audio. They're all narrated by Rachel Delude, and I would say that there's a wide array of characters that you follow throughout the whole series and in each book, and I think that she does a good job for the most part of differentiating accents between all of the characters, that it makes it more obvious to tell who's talking at one time. If it's a book that has multiple different characters that you follow, they're all third person. So if you're following Pei in one chapter and then someone else in another chapter, she doesn't change the voice while she's narrating the chapter, but she does change the voice while she's narrating their dialogue and their speech. So it's just something to consider, that if you're listening to the audiobook and you're not paying close attention, you just might get confused on whose perspective you're following. I mean, I don't think that's a negative to her. I think it's just something to consider while you're picking them up. And yeah, if you like audiobooks, I recommend them on audio. So that's all I have for this video. This is my guide to the Wayfarers series. Again, if you are new here, or if you're not and you just want to get my non-spoilery, deeper thoughts of each book in the series and how I think that they are, feel free to watch my reviews for the series. I have reviews for all 4. If they're not up when this goes up, they will be up soon. I've recorded them, I just haven't edited them. Let me know how you feel about this series. If you read them, has this convinced you that you should read them? And that is all I got. So until next time, happy reading.